Chairperson, speaking on the significance of African Month. 30 years after the dawn of democracy, we're joined now by Acting Chairperson of Social Cohesion Advocate Program, Advocate Sipho Mantula. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. An important month on the African calendar and also an important month when it comes to South Africa's dawn of democracy. What are some of the bold messages that come out of such a month?
Good evening, Po ene Jambo Africa molweni dumelang to your viewers of late edition. A very important month in the continent, considering that the month of May, despite that in 2024 we are talking of many elections taking place in the African continent, but it is also an important component of the political independence, economic independence and cultural independence that, if you look back, what you can say in 1963, when the Organization of African Unity was formed, that's where the birth of Africa Day comes from. But South Africa, if you look back, since 2014, for a decade, they've committed the whole month of May as Africa Month. Considering also that on the 23rd of May 1994, South Africa, through the then founding president Nelson Mandela and the late Foreign Affairs Minister Alfred Nzo, were in Tunisia, where they submitted a membership of South Africa to be part of the Organization of African Unity. So in that context, it gives you how we were part of the continent 30 years ago, and already the messages that are coming out, they are also on the question of the conflicts that Africa is still facing, the challenges that are still facing Africa in terms of corruption. The third aspect being the issue of the black young person identity, to understand his identity, to understand the historic mileage or the historic importance of this continent that we are part of. And interestingly, you'll recall that also tomorrow marks almost 28 years when the former President Thabo Mbeki spoke in Parliament about I am an African. So if you try to contextualize this African identity, South Africa has been taking that lead. Despite, I will say to you, Africa Day is not a public holiday in many African countries. It means that we have not yet popularized our Africanness. We have not also looked at the creative economy part of how, when we have such month, does Africa come out of this poverty scale? Africa comes out of this dependency syndrome of France and USA in terms of their cultural programs, political programs, economic programs. Hence, you can see that the celebration of the month also takes in a form of not celebrating in South Africa, but also bringing many African nationals to be part of this program through cuisine, where you have different foods, different musical dance, and also different messages coming out from different African nationals. And that's how South Africa, I can say to you, they've managed for the past decade to hold this Africa Month celebrations, despite all the challenges that we have faced for the past 30 years.
Many African nationals coming together. I mean, the theme is celebrating 30 years of freedom, building a better Africa and a better world. And as you speak about African nations coming together, of course, that in itself has been quite a bone of contention. It's more so looking at our matters here at home when you talk about some of the, the scale of the economy and unemployment and how perceptions speak to other African nationals coming into South Africa to perhaps steal jobs. That in itself is a conversation which still needs to be expanded, and a level of education also needed as we try and build a better Africa.
Absolutely, but better Africa, better world, it has to start with better Azania, better South Africa.
Yeah.
When I was at the Human Rights Commission at some point, the early signs of what you can say tensions on Afrophobia or on the issues around racial tensions began in the early 1994, actually. But the most one that we saw in this past 30 years was in 2008, when we had xenophobic attacks or the Afrophobic attacks. But also, like you said, what are the push and the pull factors? You find that there are also issues of crime being committed by our visitors that I will call us as the host, and the visitors who come and visit our shores and not being disciplined. Very important for us, like you said, to instill the issue of our cultural education, the issue of our national interest and our values. But also, let me twist it again, say to you, for our liberation and our freedom to enjoy. There was a role that was played by many African countries during the OAU days. Hence, within the OAU, we had the OAU Liberation Committee that assisted South Africa materially. It assisted the South African liberation movements. But that will not mean it is the payback time. I think the issue also, it goes with our issue of one Africa, one nation. How do we deal even with the Berlin Conference borders when we are also being regulated by borders, but our economies in Africa are shrinking, are only enjoyed by families of dynasties and presidents? And that's why you have the serious challenge there. How do you deal with inequalities in South Africa, where you have minorities still enjoying the benefits of apartheid, but you have majority of people suffering? And that's how, when we think of Africa, is that Africans, whenever there are problems, they always converge. They always have what we call lekgotla or indaba. So it is always important to introspect, but also important to say, how do we deal with the trade relations in Africa? And finally, I will say to you, Better Africa, Better World is also part of our national development plan. And I think our plan also, it lacks this sense of, is our plan a vision? Is it a dream, or is it a dream defect? Is it a wish list that 6 years from now, this is what we want to achieve? But integration of Africans at a formal level, and both informal and formal, is something that we should have dealt with in the past 8 years. And I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic that come the other 30 years, probably we might change the narrative, because Europe is able to travel without a lot of regulations in terms of visas. Europeans are able to trade among themselves with a common currency. And they have learned it from Africa. The European Union was formed on the basis of a template of Organization of African Unity. So I always find it strange that why have we left behind? Who underdeveloped Africa, even in the 21st century, that we find when we see one another, we see each other as enemies. And Malcolm X reminds us, an African who hates himself or who hates this continent is a very dangerous character. Absolutely. It's a very dangerous human being.
Advocate, before we run out of time, very quickly, I mean, you touched a little bit on identity and culture. How would you say we're faring as a nation, more so looking at the youth of today? I mean, expressing South Africa's identity and culture through food, through music, but language, of course, that in itself still perhaps needs a little bit of work, I suppose, depending on where you're looking.
Interesting for what you are raising, because even today at the launch, we emphasized on the issue of the language. We emphasized on the youth or popular culture, and the AU theme for 2024, talking about the education and African fit for education. And I think, like you said, the young people are the ones who are the bearers, who are the beneficiaries of the African freedom and African liberation. So it is important that we allow the youth, and I think we are doing well. Let us not be very we must not look down at our efforts as this country, what we have done so far. I think South Africa have made efforts from the international platforms to the continental platforms to the national platforms, and it's just a matter of time that we need accountability in our cultural institutions. We need competent leadership, because I think even in talk of young people, is how do we groom young people when we have a mist of questionable leaders in our continent? We have senior citizens who are still leaders in our continent. So you need that way of intergenerational dialogue among the youth and to inspire them. And like I said to you, I don't think we are doing bad. I think we have been the trailblazer, and hence we are the only country who celebrate the month of May not partially, but wholly as a whole month. And we, like I said, I still lament the youth need to travel Africa. But that's what we emphasize today also, that the youth must not only think of Dubai and America and London and Paris. There are more countries, Zanzibar, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, but the issue of visa regulations also. How do we weigh that? So I think it is important for it to travel, but also the African politics and science and history must be taught in our schools so that we understand the colonization and the decolonization project. Where are we, the youth of the 2015 Christmas call? We want to see a better Africa, a better South Africa, a better world. But it's through education, like I've said. And the role of media is also important, how we capture Africa. Because finally, Paul said the youth also following the social media and they follow the public media, they follow the public figures. So it is important for public figures and the media to act responsible, diligently, and to inform and educate our young people, because we are building this continent, as Bob Marley once said, Africa unite for the sake of your children.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure chatting to you. Acting Chairperson of Social Cohesion Advocates Program, Advocate Sipho Mantula, speaking to us about the significance of Africa Month, 30 years after the dawn of democracy.